Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo Wine Info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today's curious wine of the day is another brick in the monument to non-vintage blends and their rising street cred. The particular wine in the limelight today is the Salt Rock non-vintage red blend, produced with fruit mostly from Stellenbosch, but there are also a few select parcels from both Paarl and the Swartland. So all in all, this is, yea verily, a wine of origin Western Cape. But before we get to the where or the what, let's talk a little bit about the who. In one sense, the brand of Salt Rock is the basket into which two winemakers threw all of their eggs. On one side, you have winemaker Alexander Greer, who's part of the family who own Vieira Wines, the Greer family. They also own Domaine Greer in France. And he has his own label of wines called Standalone Wines, which produced a Chardonnay that got a gold medal in the Global Chardonnay Masters competition for 2025. But that's not the only trophy that Alex has grabbed, because he also claimed first place in the TV series Die Wijnmeester, which is a little like Boer Soeke Vrou, but with fewer oaks and more oak. On the other side of the Salt Rock partnership, we have Rudolf Steenkamp, who in his own right is a qualified Cape wine master, but he's also worked at Takara, which is a fairly big deal in Stellenbosch, and was the assistant winemaker at Groot Constantia under Boele Gerber. And when we're talking about big wigs in the South African wine scene, Boele Gerber was verily a kind of bony M-type hairpiece of gargantuan proportions before he got snapped up by some wine outfits in Napa in California. Rudolf was also the winemaker and viticulturalist at Haskell Vineyards in Stellenbosch, which also produced Dombeya wines, because the original estate was actually called Dombeya. And then he had his own labels, well, twin labels really, of La Niña and El Niño. At some point, Alex and Rudolf together decided that trying to juggle 5 wine brands all at once was a venous aneurysm waiting to happen. So they packed that all in and decided to consolidate everything into one single umbrella brand, Salt Rock Wines. And that's what we're here to discuss today. Now, the truth around non-vintage wines is nuanced, to say the least, because it's definitely valid to say that the vast majority of non-vintage wines around the world are kind of low-level kitchen sink pragmatic solutions to leftover dregs from wine cellars. Then on the other end of this spectrum of opinions and situations, we have wine lovers who treat a vintage statement on a label as some sort of declaration of gospel. The year number on the label is some kind of sacred truth, proof that a wine has moral fiber. So when they see a wine that doesn't have a vintage statement, they clutch their pearls and scream, heresy! And this is all good and true, except to say that for the most part, when we're drinking bottles of champagne, we seem to have no problem with a non-vintage situation. Because in the world of champagne, unless there's an absolutely exceptional vintage, the kind of default modus operandi is to blend various vintages to produce a house style. And so, as I said, the vast majority of bottles of champagne are in fact non-vintage, and yet there be no pearl clutching in that particular situation. So if you can acknowledge that no one would say champagne isn't fancy, even though the vast majority is non-vintage, then perhaps I can get you to open your mind to the fact that there may be some, yea verily, very fancy red blends that are also non-vintage. And I'd propose that today's wine of the day is exactly that. I mean, ideally, I'd like you to see non-vintage blends as some sort of Venus time travel via a rocket-propelled pipette, rather than a pragmatic kitchen sink solution to leftover wine. But perhaps we have to wait till the end of the video for you to reach that point. And perhaps to massage you along the journey, I'd like to propose that there are things that a non-vintage blend can do that a single vintage wine cannot do. I'd even go further and say that if Dr. Strange was a winemaker, he'd make non-vintage blends, because there is a level of dynamism that's possible when you take parcels of wine from various points through time. But if you really want the full rant on that, I'll leave a link to a video where I deep dive on non-vintage winemaking at the end of this video. For those of you who appreciate the nitty-gritty details, in this particular edition of the Salt Rock non-vintage red blend, there are 6 cultivars across 4 vintages. The very oldest vintage is a 2016 parcel of Merlot, and then there are additions of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Syrah, and Cinsault, which are mixed between the 2023 and the 2024 vintages. And to bring back the topic of champagne, the goal here is not to immortalize a single vintage, but rather to produce an incredibly high quality wine from incredibly high quality parcels of wine that just happen to have come from different eras. And if we're to pause for a second and just take a pragmatic view at the wine industry, which happens to be mostly in the toilet right now, you'll realize that there is a lot of very high quality wine sitting in cellars around the world looking for a home. And sometimes the ability to take a few of those parcels and expertly blend them together into something absolutely fabulous is a solution that manages to shift wine without diluting brand equity, which is the thing for some folk. But then again, don't take my word for it. Let's get into the glass and you can taste it for yourself. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, there really is some glorious depth to it, because you have roasted, savory plum fruit and some cocoa dusting, but then there's also sweeter, fresher kind of blackcurrant pastel, cassis, and even notes of cedarwood and maraschino cherry as well. So let's give it a sip and see what awaits us on the palate. So the wine is by no means flabby or bolshy. It's fairly restrained while still having black fruit, but it's kind of tied up in fairly nice structure. I would imagine that's most likely the Petit Verdot and Cabernet Sauvignon parcels that manage to tie all the ripe fruit together, because you get the roasted plum and the blueberry and the black maraschino cherry, but it's kind of held in place by these rather firm tannins. And when I say firm, they're not green or brash or youthful. They really are quite smooth. And you go, but how can they be firm and smooth at the same time? To answer this, I've used before the example of chalk dust. You can rub chalk dust into your hand, which definitely dries out your hands, but also leaves your fingertips feeling rather smooth. So in the same way, the tannins in your mouth can dry out your mouth, but still have a sensation of being velvety or smooth. Another element that pops up on the palate, which is pretty cool, is a slightly dried fruit element, which is alongside the much fresher kind of red plum and black plum and black currant elements. So you have those tertiary, slightly dried notes from your older Merlot component, and then you have fresher fruit, which is a lot rarer when you're dealing with a wine from a single vintage. And then perhaps towards the end, there's also a little hint of sort of herbal spice, kind of like a rocket leaf touch right at the back. And I would imagine that's partially as a result of some Syrah in there, although you never can be sure. Really, it's a beautifully dynamic wine. But if the first glass didn't convince you of it, then pour yourself a second glass, because maybe that will be more convincing. And while you do that, I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos, one of which will deep dive on non-vintage winemaking, as I mentioned earlier. And the other is a video that takes a look at tertiary notes in wine, how they get there, what sort of character they take on, and how to talk about it if you want to be slightly more technical with your wine lingo. So until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.